Well, after Trent Bridge, you had this great sense of optimism that it was going to be a great series because you had a close finish, which was artificial in a sense because without those two last wicket partnerships, Australia wouldn't have been in the game at all. And then reality bit really hard at Lords, where you had 2.5 days of basically just waiting for a result everyone knew at pretty much at lunch on the second day.
Oh yeah, having been there, the way the perception of the series shifted, in the build-up everybody wrote off Australia because they thought the fans, the media, especially the British media, completely wrote off Australia, saying this was the weakest team to come to England to play the Ashes since anybody could remember. And then the manner in which the Australians conducted themselves at press conferences, Michael Clarke, Darren Lehmann, they seemed very confident, they seemed not brash, they were not making predictions like before, but they did seem to believe that they were there to do something constructive, that their batsmen, despite the failures in India in these different conditions, would perhaps be able to deliver, and they were confident in their bowling unit. This was completely shattered at Trent Bridge, in that the tail made the runs and the top order didn't even look like they were going to go on and make a big score, any of them, and got confirmed at Lords. So I think from guarded optimism, it went back to cynicism and then sort of confirmation that Australia were indeed going to struggle with this batting lineup.
And it is going to be a struggle. I mean, you have David Warner potentially coming in for Old Trafford on the basis of one innings in South Africa. Before that, he failed twice in Zimbabwe. But again, Warner is the kind of batsman who's Hollywood or bust. He might make an 80-ball 100, but then 5 innings he might be out in single figures.
Yes, and Warner's not really the kind of batsman who can just walk into a team. Sure, he made 193 and batted it for a fairly long period, but the manner in which Australia have had to juggle their batting lineup itself, it was not long ago that Warner and Cowan were a set partnership, and even if a young one trying to build a reputation for themselves as a unit, and then now Cowan's gone out of the side, Warner might bat at 6, you have Khwaja who batted up the order and then lower the order, you have Phil Hughes who Australia is not sure exactly how to use. So he's made some runs, he's at least gutsed it out in one innings, and like everyone keeps saying, so much depends on Michael Clarke, unless he makes 150. It's difficult for those around him to even get the kind of confidence they need to take on this English bowling attack.
And no one else seems to know how to bat time, do they? I mean, you saw the difference at Lords where Root batted in first gear for 2 or 3 hours, and then he built his innings as he went along, and by the end of it he was really fluent. So that sort of player is completely missing in this Australian lineup once you take out Clarke.
Yes, many of them have strong defensive skills, but when you have conditions like the ones these test matches are being played on, where there's reverse swing playing a fairly big part, after maybe day 3 there's a lot of turn, Graham Swan's completely in the game at most times. It's hard for any batsman who's not confident of his defense to be able to build an innings. They get into a sort of mode where they're just trying to block, and then a good ball comes along and again you lose 2-3 wickets in a heap. So I think unless somebody controls the game, which you can only see Clarke doing, you can see Watson going bang bang at the top of the order, but unfortunately by the time he gets 30 or 40 he seems to use his front pad rather than the bat. And unless Clarke really becomes the backbone of this Australian lineup, it's hard to see them putting on 350, and if they don't put on 350 then you're going to see test matches finishing in 4 days.
I mean, Michael Holding is one in his recent Wisden India column who suggested that Clarke should be higher up the order, even at number 3. Now there are a lot of people who say, but he does his best work at number 5. Where do you stand on that?
Well, statistically he's best at number 5, but he was number 5 in a different Australian lineup, and this is a different Australian batting lineup. In this lineup, it's almost as though the fate of the entire innings depends on him. It doesn't mean that he has to do all the scoring or that others can't make runs. There are people on the side who have shown that they can take on these English bowlers. But to do it consistently, to do it for a long enough period of time, I think there's no better way to go forward than getting the best batsman in at number 3 and playing as many overs as he can.
I don't think there is such thing as a happy place when a team's losing and losing badly at that. I have been stunned by the criticism of Watson. I mean, there were reasons for that at Lord's. The review that he went for was one, but I've seldom seen that level of venom directed at one individual player. I mean, there was maybe an instance a few years ago with Saurav Ganguly in the Indian side where he polarized opinion to a great extent, but the Watson situation really seems quite similar.
It seems like this is something that happens every time Australia go to England. The last time it was Mitchell Johnson. It didn't matter what he did, he sort of became the comic figure, the figure that the crowds love to make fun of, the figure that the media attacked on Twitter, and former cricketers then jumped on the bandwagon a bit. And as you say about Watson, in the first 2 test matches, though he's been out in disappointingly similar fashion, he's still the second highest run getter for Australia. And if you take Ashton Agar out of the equation, because that was a freak innings on debut, then he's the highest run getter in this Australian team. That if there is a rift in the team, or if people are unhappy with Watson's place in the side, the easiest way for them is to make more runs than him. If you want to get rid of a teammate for whatever reason, then you need to be performing yourself to start with.
Plus the fact that Watson was one of the more impressive bowlers as well. He bowls dry, he doesn't give too much away. He can reverse swing the ball. So on paper, he's certainly one of the bigger assets that they have after Clark.
Yeah, he is, and in Trent in those conditions where the ball was reversing a lot, he bowled a 13-over spell in which, if I remember correctly, he bowled 11 maidens and gave away only 2 or 3 runs. And that ensured that even though the batting was not doing that well, Australia had some control over the game. They didn't let England run away with it. He got Alistair Cook out at Lord's when he came on to bowl much earlier than expected after Pattinson was disappointing in the first innings. So there is a lot of value that Watson brings to the side, and as Darren Lehman kept telling us, he thought that the big innings was just around the corner, but he didn't want to keep saying that either. He wanted to see it happen. So it's been a while since Watson's gone big in a test match, and when he does, this Australian lineup will look very different. Yes, but you must also remember that this England side is a very different one when James Anderson's firing and when he's not. We haven't seen the best of Graeme Swann yet, though he was among the wickets. He got a lot of wickets, but he definitely has bowled better in the past. He's also coming back from 2 or 3 different kinds of injuries, so he might get better as the series goes on. In terms of the batting, Kevin Peterson, Jonathan Trott, Alistair Cook, the 3 really big guns on the side haven't got going yet, and still games are finished in 4 days. So England, in terms of the batting, the best could be yet to come. But I also am a bit worried about the kind of workload Jimmy Anderson has had to shoulder, simply because the others haven't been able to step up at the crucial moments. The captain seems to have to keep going back to Anderson whenever he needs a partnership broken. And I think in a 5-test series that's unsustainable. One bowler can't do all the heavy lifting. So I'd like to see what England will be like when Anderson isn't at his best. If he's having an off day, how the England team copes, I think that could well decide how we remember the other bowlers in this England team. But 2 tests down, 3 more to go, and then a further 5 at the end of the year in England. In a 5-test series, there's no place to hide, is there? I mean, you can get away with 1 failure or 2 failures in a 3-test series, but at the end, if you fail in a 5-test series, that's pretty much your career gone.
Yeah, and that's the scary thing for this Australian side. Like you said, the really heavy hitters in the England side haven't even come to the party yet. And you look at the bowling too. Like you said, Swann can get better. Broad, I thought, bowled particularly well in the latter half of the Lord's match without reward. He's going to have one game-changing spell at some stage, I'm sure. Finn's not going to bowl as badly as he did in that first test. Bresnan does a job for him. It's really hard to see who Australia are going to target in the coming games, because this England lineup is going to get better, both the batting and the bowling.